Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today we're going to be going over the last of the Sorceress spells, and that's it. We're finished. I'm actually pretty excited about this. In fact, I think the only class left is the Assassin, and then we're done with all the classes. So today we're going to be going over the Hydra. The Hydra is a very interesting ability that has some pretty interesting problems. We're going to talk about how good it is, and we're also going to talk about how bad it is, both at the same time, because it's both good and bad. Hydra is at its core, just simply a little doojank that you spawn on the ground. He has multiple heads, and he dishes out some pretty decent damage by shooting multiple fire bolts. That's right, fire bolts, not fireballs. Firebolts is the lesser of the two in terms of damage output, because fireballs will shoot and they explode in a radial damage, whereas firebolts don't really do any radial damage. And when you cast Hydras, they used to a long time ago, it used to be a big delay between casting them, but they recently changed Hydras so that you can spam them. So you basically just cast them really quickly. There's just a cap on the number of Hydras that you can spawn, and as soon as you reach that maximum number, the previous one disappears. So Hydras basically are now kind of like traps. You deploy them, and then you just move on and let them do their thing. Now, when Hydras are attacking a monster, what they do is they just simply, all three of them will fire bolts. They fire bolts in sequence, so let me see if I can find one monster here. And basically what they do is they go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and they just continually fire their bolts in that way. Now, I don't have them leveled up right now because I'm trying to show off how they attack, and I feel like this is pretty much the best way. You're talking about 3 firebolt attacks from each Hydra head, and of course you can have multiple Hydras. So with 6 total Hydras, you have 3 bolts per Hydra head, and it calculates out to a lot of individual hits that do a pretty decent amount of damage. One of the biggest issues with Hydras, in my opinion, is that they suck at tracking targets. So like, a lot of the times, because of the relatively slow projectile speed, and also the fact that monsters tend to be very fast, they don't really hit targets if the targets are moving. And we were just talking about this last video, how basically all of the skills in the fire tree kind of require the monsters not to move, and Hydra is no exception. If the monster stands still, it does pretty significant damage, but if they're moving around, it has a much harder time actually tracking and hitting the targets. I would really like to see Hydras get some sort of tracking buff in the future to help them track the targets a little bit better, because they're terrible. They're absolutely terrible at tracking targets. Now, synergistically wise, it's not really a huge investment. It only does require 20 points in Hydras, 20 points in Firebolt, 20 points in Fireball, and of course 20 points in Fire Mastery. So it's a total of 20, 40, 60, 80 points, which is not as bad as some of the other skills that have like a 100-point investment, but it's not as good as some of the 60-point investments either. Now, once you get it all capped out and you've got your plus to skills and you've got all your little doojanks running, it actually does some pretty respectable damage at about 4,986 damage. And of course, it's multiplied by the number of Hydras that you have, and eventually it does reach some pretty nice numbers. But again, one of the issues is that if the monsters aren't standing still, it's not going to do very much damage. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves about this particular ability, is that you really kind of need the monsters to just not move, which usually means that you need to not move, because if you're running around, then the monsters are probably going to be running around too. Another big issue with the ability is that it doesn't do well in groups. So the bigger the group, the less effective the Hydras are, to the point of kind of absurdity. Because each Hydra is firing a bolt, and then each head fires its own, with 3 bolts per head and 6 Hydras total, you end up with a pretty silly amount of bolts of 3 times 6, and then they fire like multiple bolts per second, so you end up with some pretty crazy bolts. Let's just say like 3. You end up with like 54 bolts in the air at any given time, which is kind of insane, and every single bolt has to hit the target to actually dish out the kind of damage that you're looking for. And this is one of the biggest issues with this build, is that if you don't have all of the bolts hitting a target, things kind of go pear-shaped pretty fast. Most notably is places like the cow level. So when you go into the cow level on a Hydra Sorceress, and you have all these monsters, all these ridiculously large number of cows that are charging you in a line, what you end up with is a very odd situation where the Hydras are dishing out pretty decent damage, and they could take out 1 or 2 cows, or maybe even 3 or 4 cows, particularly easy. But when they try and take out a group of cows, this is where things get particularly nasty. And let me see if I can show you this real quick. Let's go ahead and grab our leg. Doot. Put my infinity pole arm back on the mercenary.
Good day.
I bet you guys didn't know you could do this.
I'll put that to good use.
And it actually works. You can drag items to the portrait and put them on the mercenary that way. It's actually pretty interesting. Alright, so let's grab a Tome of Town of Portalis. And we go find some cows. Now, if you're fighting just a small number of cows, it tends to do okay. It can focus fire 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 cows fairly easily. But when you get into the really big groups of cows, like, which is how most people like to kill cows, you know, big groups of Javazons, big groups of various mosaic sins and things like that, and you start to get these really big groups of cows, this is where Hydras really start to not do as well. Because they're only dishing out damage to single targets. And they have to dish out their damage, you know, to whatever is nearby. They don't always attack the same target, so you'll only have maybe 1 or 2 Hydras attacking a particular target at a particular time, and things just don't work out as well with large groups. Hydras, however, did get a buff recently, and I feel like we should probably talk about that as well, is that their single target damage actually went up. And to display their single target damage, I think the easiest way to do this would be to pull out a Uber Diablo. Let's see if we can pull out an Uber Diablo real quick. I know there's probably a Soj on one of these people. Yes, we got a Soj right here. Alright, so we're going to sell this to the NPC, and then we're going to bring out Uber Diablo for the fun of it. Now, P8 Uber Diablo is a little too spicy for an Hydra build. We're probably not going to be able to do P8 Uber Diablo unless I get some very specific equipment. So instead, we're going to run P1 Uber Diablo. Now, Uber Diablo generally tends to stay pretty still. But the problem with him is he does have some pretty extreme regeneration. And even with the regeneration that Uber Diablo has, which is the reason why I chose him, you notice that the Hydras are still able to burn through his regeneration, which is pretty impressive, or at least it should be if you know how fast he regenerates. So players 1 Uber Diablo, you don't even have to cancel out his regeneration, because the Hydras are capable of burning through his regeneration damage-wise. But that's only single target, and this is where the Hydras really excel, is their single target damage output. When all 6 Hydras are attacking the same target, when that target is standing still, that's where the damage output is the best. And of course, he managed to cage me and kill me. Now, if you add in some negative regeneration, you can actually kill P1 Uber Diablo fairly fast. It's actually really easy to do, by the way. All you really need is an edge bow. Which is one of the cheapest rune words to make, by the way. So what you do is you grab something like... I think she actually has an edge bow on her. Yes, she does. Let me go grab this edge bow real quick so we can utilize this for the test. course, I'd have to actually respawn Uber Diablo, which I don't have another Soge. So we'll have to save that for another day. However, just adding in the Mercenary has a pretty huge effect as well.
I can't carry
Negative resistance, of course, always has a pretty big effect on the outcome. But it's interesting to note that the next hit delay changes that recently were added in with 2.7 made something very odd happen with the Hydra. So it used to be a long time ago that Hydras would interfere with other Hydras, which was kind of odd. And I don't really know why the hell that even happened. But if you look at the next hit delay list, there actually is a listing for the Hydras on the next hit delay calculator. It is called... Been a little while since I pulled it up. It's called like Dragon Flamehead or something like that. I can't remember the exact way that it was stated. But because of that, the single target damage on the ability actually increased pretty dramatically. Because instead of interfering with each other like they were doing before, all of the Hydras can now hit the target at the same time. And this means that each individual Hydra, while it might be able to interfere with itself, can't interfere with the other 5 Hydras. So the damage output of the single target attacks for Hydras was actually increased about 5 times what it normally is. And I never even knew that Hydras had an next hit delay event. But upon testing this, and if you want to check this out, I actually do have a patch 2.7 testing video where we actually were able to kill players 8 Diablo with Hydras, by the way. Just Hydras. We didn't test anything else out in the scenario. Now, in normal situations, you would utilize static. You would utilize maybe things like Meteor or Fireball or something to go along with the effects. It wouldn't just be Hydras. But what we wanted to see was, can we kill players 8 Diablo with only Hydras? And the buff to Hydras actually did make it possible. Players 8 Uber Diablo has a lot more health and is a lot tankier than P1 Uber Diablo, and the regeneration is pretty awful. I did utilize an edge bow to cancel that regeneration, by the way. So I utilized the edge bow to cancel the regeneration and then spammed him with Hydras, and he did eventually die. I think it took like a couple minutes, but it was doable. I definitely think it would have went a lot faster if I threw in a couple of meteors, a couple of fireballs, some static field and things like that. But the test wasn't really to see how well static field worked. The test wasn't to see, how well meteor worked. We already know how well that stuff works. We just wanted to see how well Hydras had been increased in damage over before. Unfortunately, though, even with the damage output increase on Hydras, they still tend to be very subpar damage-wise when you're dealing with large groups of monsters, as I demonstrated with the cow level earlier. And it's really just a matter of them only being able to hit one target at a time with each fire bolt. I actually would kind of like to see a change to Hydras, and it's a really simple one. I would like to see them change it from Firebolt to Fireball, and maybe decrease the damage a little bit. This would allow Hydras to be a little bit more AoE damage and a little less single target. Their single target damage is already amazing, and I don't think anybody is questioning that. But their AoE damage, their multi-target damage output is god-awful bad. Like, it gets to the point where if there's too many monsters on the screen, the Hydras are basically doing nothing. And it's quite sad. But a change from the Hydras from Firebolt to Fireball could possibly be exactly what Hydras need to kind of branch out into a more useful situation where they're not just, completely useless in certain situations like, cow level when there's tons of monsters around. All in all, Hydra is definitely one of those interesting abilities, and the changes recently have definitely made it better. Damage-wise, it has been increased pretty significantly. The ability to cast 6 Hydras very quickly has definitely made it a lot easier to just drop them like bombs. So before, I'm not sure if you guys remember from before, but it was a lot like this. It was like cast 1, 2, 3, 4. Cast. 1, 2, 3, 4. Cast. 1, 2, 3, 4. Cast. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, it was pretty rough. Like, casting a full thing of Hydras required some pretty serious dedication to holding down the button for a rather long period of time to actually get those Hydras all up on the screen at any given point. And then by the time you finished casting all of your Hydras, the first one was then disappearing. And so it basically required you to hold the Hydra button down all the time to keep those Hydras up on the field. And now that they've changed it to more like a bomb drop where you can literally just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you can cast them all that quickly, it allows you to weave in other spells a lot easier now. So if you do want to build Hydra along with something else, like a Hydra Fireball or Hydra Meteor or something along those lines, it's actually something that's really quite doable at this point, because you can very easily cast your 6 Hydras within a very quick period of time, and then start working on whatever the other spell is that you want. And you can get off a considerably large number of those spells before the first one starts to disappear, recast your Hydras, and then start casting your Fireballs again. It has turned the ability from kind of something that nobody really used into an ability that actually has some actual usefulness now. With a couple more tweaks, hopefully in the future, maybe Hydras will hit the point where they will be a lot more popular than they are now, but as it is, they're kind of a subpar skill that has limited usefulness in big group scenarios. I think that's pretty much it for Hydra. There's really not a lot more to go over with this particular ability. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, and keep watching.